Okay, everybody. I hope you had a good break. If you went to grab a drink or went to go outside in the sunshine, which we're not having here in Vancouver at the moment. But we are back for session number 2. Oh, and if anyone was asking, that countdown was actually made in Notch as well. So, all right. This is the workshop part of it. So we are going to be building these looks together, or something similar to this look. It doesn't have to be the same. So we are going to start looking at the first option here. So if we jump into our Notch DFX and under session 2, let's jump into glass tower finished. Now this is going to start resolving itself and just refining in the background while we talk about this. But this is broken up into a couple of different sections. So what we have on this side over here in this region, we have our procedural setup, which is the main sort of glass section. What I have in the bottom down here is the central glowing cylinder, and that has a slice deformer on it, so we can get those nice lines. What we have over on the far left is our post effects, so our glows and things like that. In green, we have our path tracing. I can actually zoom in now because it is finished doing its refining. We have our path tracing, and I've just put the numbers I've used for the value. So in here under Pathtracer, you'll see that the glossy, diffuse, and refraction. And this is what I was saying before, is like, while you are ray tracing something like this, your viewport may start lagging a bit, so it's much easier to just turn that off. So at the top, what I've actually got around the outside of this is a rounded box, so a rounded shaped 3D box. And I've just used the glass material of this particular one, and I've set it to show back faces only. So if I go to double-sided, it's going to look a little bit weird here for now. But if I make it into the back faces only, it's only going to show me the inside of the cube, and it's going to reflect everything inside it. So that's my my way of doing nice borders. So when we're saying this one was designed specifically for Instagram, so I created a border that would fit this. If we were doing something like this for a 16:9 window like we have here, we can just come into the box shape, and under the Y section here, we can just hold Alt and drag that out. And this is going to be a little jittery just because we are working with some heavy renders. Control Z. So that's that one there. Now, when we go to look into the procedural system, we can see there are 2 sections I've split this up into. Now, I want all of these rings that are going around each other to sort of slowly morph together and sort of just like blend a little bit. So we're using that smooth union. Now, I would normally split things up to be 2 different procedural meshing systems, but because they need to all react as one, I'm instead using nulls to move them around separately. And we'll go into that into the next slide when we actually see the geometry a little bit smoother. The one more thing I really wanted to show off here was there's no lighting node. So there's no skylight, there are no directional lights, there are no area lights. This entire system is being lit by, if I turn these off, one sec, hide that. So there's the central core that lights everything in there. But the way I've actually achieved the lighting in this zone is there are 2 glowing. Wow, this really, one second, I'm just going to turn off AI denoiser because this is, again, this is what I mean by procedurals will chew all the available resources you have. So let's take that off. Let's take that off. Let's make that 2 for now, just so we can see what we're doing. So all of this cyan, all this magenta that's coming in are actually 2 just shaped 3D planes, like basic planes. But there is an option in here in the material. You can see at the moment they're just orbiting like this. Now that gives us the same look. but we can see these giant like shape 3D planes glowing in the scene. So I was trying to find a way to have really complex and really controllable reflections and refractions, not necessarily lighting, because with glass, we're not using the diffuse, so that the normal lighting as much as we would in something like a rough metallic. This is going to be smooth. So I could get away with just using reflection bounces. So what I found when I was looking through a lot of the materials inside of Notch is you can use a standard material. So let's even build one of these ourselves. So bring in a material. We're going to unhook the matte magenta here. So just Control-1 to turn it off. And I'm just going to bring our new material in. Now, what's going to happen is this is going to be treated as a diffuse white. So it's going to receive the color for the blue. Let's come into this material. Let's give it something like a green. So we want to make the color a bright green. Now, it's still not emitting color. It's just bouncing off. All of this green we see here is the bounce back from that green. But if we come into emissiveness and we say we want it to be 2, it's a bit much, 1. Now, this big green plane is functioning as an area light for reflection and refraction, which I think is really cool because we can do some really complex stuff with that. Now, the really cool thing with all of these is there is that function in here, again, under material. We scroll down to under the settings. There is an unseen by camera checkbox. You click that. And now it just hides it. It still does all the reflection in the glass, no, because the glass still technically sees the shape, but the camera doesn't see it. So it's a really, really cool way is if you want to put like rays of light going through a glass surface. So again, that onion example right at the start, all of those have the emissive materials. Let's actually jump back into those if I can find it. Here we go. So these ones here, they're just a shaped 3D cylinder with an emissive material, and that's just lighting all of that up. There's no actual light. Here, there is a flat plane of orange at the bottom and a blue plane above that's giving all that lighting look, but there's no actual lights in the scene. So that's probably my main, not trade secret, but my way of like getting a lot of the looks I do is use the fake lighting built into that section there. All right, we've already chewed through 10 minutes. We've got to go fast like Sonic. Okay, next section here. We are going to have a look at how we're going to break this down. So in the version that's been shown, there are 2 sets of rings. Each one is going counterclockwise from each other, so they're rotating around. There's different thicknesses in the rings, so one set will be maybe thicker and one set will be thinner, or you can make one set square and one set round. I've said that we want to make both sets blob together when they're close, so that's where our smooth union is going to come into play. I want to have a central glowing cylinder or some sort of central object that is going to illuminate the scene from the inside. We're going to have 2 colors of moving planes that are going to simulate our lighting for reflection and refraction, which we just saw before. We're going to use a glass material with low roughness. Now, we don't really want to have the material itself be shown. We just want to show what it sees either through it or how it's bouncing the light around. And I'm just going to stay just for a brief that we are targeting Instagram and we're going to look for a square border. So that's our parameters. Say we were going to be approached by a client. That's sort of what we're looking for. All right, so let's just dive into this. Because this isn't ray traced, we can actually run it in real time. So this is what that geometry looks like. So I can come in and say, I'm just going to remove the housing. And I'm also going to remove that central cylinder. So what's left is our procedural. So let's break this down a bit more. Let's break this apart. Oh, come on, Notch. Oh, okay. It's going to do this. So one thing I will say right now while this recovers is this is not an efficient file. This file is designed to render out and not play back, and generally not mess around with it too much. So we're looking at our vertical order. Let's just turn this one completely off. Actually, that's probably the worst one. Let's leave that one back on. So we can look at these. Now there are 4 rings. So how do we get rings to work inside of procedurals? Now, as a clone tool. So the cool thing with a clone tool is it actually matters where you move the clone. So it's not like your cloner before where you say, I want 8 clones in height, and it will just spread them out. How this works is much more like the cloner if you're using iterative cloning. So you have to actually move the cloner in space. You can still tell it how many clones you want, but you actually physically have to move it. And to counteract that movement, we're putting all of this as the child of a null object. So we can then counteract the movement up, back down. So again, a null, which we're also using to rotate, and a cloner. Now that cloner is going to clone everything that's underneath it. And this is a fairly complex shape. So what do we have? Well, we've got one shape down the far bottom of all of this, which is our final subtraction. This is basically going to take that central core and make sure it's completely hollow all the way through. Like right now, you'll see this is blocking, this would block where that central cylinder goes. And you want to create like an empty atrium for that central place to have its own lighting source. So we have, stepping through all of this, basic octagons. From there, we want to clone out some holes, and then we're going to cut a wedge out. Now, the stacking order is really, really important when it comes to notch. And this little animation here is probably the best way to explain that in order. So the order of operations, as it steps through, is basically we're going to start with our primitive octagon. We're then going to clone a radial amount of boxes, which are the green. We'll then subtract that whole cloner, because that cloner now treats itself as an entity, and we can say union, subtract, or whatever it is, independent of how the internal parts of that cloner are working. That probably didn't make a lot of sense, but I'll step through with it anyway. And then we are subtracting the wedge box, which is the blue, to create that shape. And then we're finally subtracting that central core. So that's our part there. So why don't we start this? We're going to create a new layer. Oh, sorry. Right click, insert layer. Let's call this glass tower V2. Hey, 15 minutes in. So way down the bottom here, let's bring that into our scene. So we're going to start with the root. So the first thing we want to do, like we showed at the start, we're going to do our procedural root. So procedural, we need a procedural root. We're also going to need procedural meshing. So meshing. Control R will link things automatically to the closest root. All right, and we're going to start with a disk. So let's go a 3D primitive, and again, under procedurals, 3D primitive, bring that in. Let's make our bounding box. Bring that in, set that to our bounding box here. And we're just going to make our sphere a little bit more of a cylinder and start work. So again, as Armin and Ryan described, it's probably good to have something to visualize what volume we're working inside. So a shape 3D cube. Bring this in, hook it up. Now, shape 3D, oh, sorry. Sphere. We want that to be a box, and we want to set the box to radius. Now, all of this is going to look a little bit weird because we haven't set up any of our lighting. So again, click on our root. We're going to come across and we're going to say deferred rendering. Don't worry if it goes black, it's fine. High dynamic range and linear space lighting. Now to start with, we're going to add a skylight. It's just the fastest way to get nice even light to see how we're working. Drag it in, Control R. Inside our skylight, because we're not going to be using ray tracing at the start, we can turn down the samples. So we come across here and let's just say 20 by 20 by 20, just so we can get a top-down light that's easy to see. Let's return to this box quickly and just go through what we need to do. So in our box we're using to visualize, turn the visibility to 0. Scroll down, find our lines, and then turn them to 1. Okay, there's our lines visible. Inside of the lines here, we can just use thick lines, sorry. And then now that's visible there. That's our volume. Okay. We are 15 minutes in, time to put the hammer down. So that's our shape across there. Now let's revisit how to start making some interesting things using this cylinder. So inside of our primitive, we have the general options. We've got our radius, we can make it larger and smaller, and we can make it height. So let's crunch it down. Let's say something like 0.2. Yeah, 0.2 is fine. So we've got a little bit of a disc here. But what if we don't want it to just be round? Let's just say we want to add more facets to it. So we can come into the profile here under our procedural primitive. Oh, this is so bad for plosives. Circular, we can change it to polygonal. And now we have the option to say how many sides we want. Do you want this to be a hexagon? Do you want this to be a triangle, like sort of prism? I'm going to go with what we had before, which was our octagon. So now we've got our octagon shape modeled in. It's kind of cool. So now let's just say we want to start thinking about this like that cloning system we had before. So before we go any further in it, let's add a procedural null. So from the meshing into the null, and from the null into the primitive. Just now, it means that we can move this whole system around independent. Okay. So how do we go about cutting those holes? All right. Well, let's think about it as 2 steps. We need to add the shapes we're going to clone in, and then we need to subtract them away. So let's add just another primitive in here. Let's drop it underneath again. So from the null, drag in. And this is huge. This is a sphere. It's not what we want. We want a box. But let's drop this size down. So we want to make this really, really thin. So the height can stay at 1. Let's say we drop it down to 0.15 and 0.25. So now if we look across here, we've got this shape sticking out. Don't worry about that edge there. Oh, now we've noticed that. We should probably revisit this. Make sure to go click Seal Boundaries. All right. Now that's not too bad. We can come in here and say, let's just go and immediately just subtract this. And we've got a hole. And we can manually come in and add, 4 of these, rotate them all independently and make them work like that. Or we can use that clone tool we found before. So bringing in procedural clone, bring it in. We want to make the clone a child of the null. Because remember, this is our master for this ring set. This is the ring. The clone. Actually, we can probably bring the clone as a child of the primitive and bring that in here. All right. So now we actually run into a problem because this clone is set to union and we have subtraction set on the primitive. So we don't want that. Let's just remove that back to union. So now we've put it back in the way it was before. We actually want to create a union of these shapes and then subtract them. So on our clone, let's say we want to have 4 clones and we want to slowly start rotating these around. We can probably get away with, at 45. So now what we've done is we've taken 4 different copies of this box, rotated them each around 45 degrees, and they're now set to union. So if we now say the clone, not the box, but the clone itself is going to set to subtract, now it deletes all of those at once. So we can come in here again and say, look, maybe those holes are taken away far too large. So let's just add a bit more of the shape back into it. And there we go. That's our first fairly basic complex unit. So from this again, all right, we're going to treat this primitive as the main root here under the null. Let's say we want to start doing another cut. So let's bring another primitive. Drop it in the bottom. This one will do that wedge cutout. So we're going to make it a box. We want to set it to subtract. And you can see it's taken away everything. That's only because the box is the size of everything else there. But we can just move this across to the side. Let's just say, I think that is 1 unit and 1 unit. Oh, sorry, not up. We make that 0 and 1 unit in Z. And now we've cut that wedge shape out, which we saw before. All right. And the final one we want to do is another primitive. Bring that in. Child again. And this one will be our cylinder. Send our radius something a little bit smaller in the middle. Say 0.5, 0.4. And we're going to make that our subtract. So again, going by the order of operations from the top, we started with the 3D primitive, which is our cylinder octagon. So let's probably come in and start naming these before it gets a bit weird. F5 key brings up the name. So let's go octagon. Now this cloner is going to be the holes. So let's call this clone holes. Let's call this hole shape. This one here will be the wedge subtract. And this one will be the cylinder subtract. Okay. So now we've got this. We've got it inside our null. We want to clone it vertically. So let's bring in our clone again. And we're going to put that in between these two shapes. So we drag it from our null to our clone. And then we drag that back to our octagon. Cool. Now when we move our clone up in space, we can get and drop this back down. We can get a clone of our objects. But what if we want to make it look like before we had it stepping? So we take this clone and we say we want our heading to be 90. So now it's going to turn 90 degrees each time it goes around. Now this octagon hole system is probably a little bit small. So let's just say we want to scale it down. And again, because we've made everything a child of this original octagon, they will all scale nicely with it. Bring our position to say 0.5. And here we go. We have our first set. All right, so now's probably a good time we can probably start jumping into adding some of that lighting. So we are 23 minutes into our 50-minute session. So our lighting, as we explained before, we're not going to be using lights. We are going to be using planes and emissive materials. So let's go in here, shape 3D. That's a sphere there. We want to change that from the, I apologize for the cat in the background, change it to a plane. We want to make it much larger. And we want to rotate this on the bank. Say 92. Cool. Now, if we just move this off to the side, let's add a material. Standard material is fine. Click in. Now, the difference is if you add the emissive material thinking you just want to go that way, you can't actually check that box, which is hidden by camera, which is the box we really need. So don't use the emissive material, just use the standard material. Come in, let's turn the emissiveness to 1. Let's give it something like a cyan color. Come into the material again, and we have that option afterwards of going unseen by camera. Okay. Now this is not going to have any effect at the moment because 1, we're not using ray tracing. And two, we're not using anything that is going to bounce the light around the space. So we really need to add the Pathtracer node back into here. So at this point, we are going to find a space for it. Bring in Pathtracer. Now, before we're talking about, we want our depths, everything. This is the default session. We're going to leave it as it is at the moment. Control R to hook that to the main route. And now when we bring in our ray tracing, we start to see that blue light is affecting our scene because it's bouncing the light off of this emissive surface onto our scene. We can even now come and hide our skylight. And this scene right now is being 100% lit by an emissive quad. Pretty cool. So let's take this, the final thing we actually want to really show here, which is the actual glass material. So if we come across to our search, go for glass RT material. Before we apply this is a good time to save. So save as 2. I only say that because it's just always good if before you do anything that involves path tracing or ray tracing, if you have been doing a lot of work for a while, if you have an older GPU or even mine, it can trip up every so often. So just remember that it's always good to save. It will auto save as well. Notch will auto save in the background, but it's just good to have a nice save. So this glass material we want to apply directly to our procedural meshing node. So take the output of the glass into the procedural meshing tool. And now all of a sudden it's disappeared. So it's not really visible. Let's come into our path tracer. Let's give our max refraction depth maybe to 5 and our reflection depth to 4. So now we're starting to see a little bit more. So let's make another one of these planes. Let's just duplicate this. Highlight them both, Control D, duplicate it, hook it up to the root. And let's just do minus of what's here. So let's go minus 2.5 and minus 90. So now it's lit from both sides. And you can see when you start getting around the angles, you get that really nice glass sort of refraction effect coming in. Now, what we also have here is we've got really sharp edges, so it doesn't look quite as clean and nice as it could look. So let's come in, let's hide these quads to really help us see what things are doing. So go into the material options, scroll down to settings, turn on unseen by camera, and now we just have the glass material left. We can probably hide our volume at this point as well, so which is our Shape 3D box. So if you are not familiar with Notch's viewpoint, holding down the Alt key and dragging with the middle mouse button will let you look around. Alt key and left mouse button will let you look. So let's make this let's make you a pink. So you got those two colors on either side. So let's say we want to get a bit more of the color looking coming in. So let's come to our glass and just add a tiny amount of roughness. Say like a 0.1. So now we're starting to see the surface of the glass coming in a bit more. The other thing we can do, and like we mentioned earlier, in our procedural meshing node, there was the option for smoothing iterations. So let's just say, let's give this a smoothing iteration of 10. And now we're starting to see these edges just start to round up a little bit nicer. So we're starting to see some nicer sort of refraction coming in around the corners. It's not too bad, but it really is still lacking something. And that something for me is definitely the central column where we have that emissive central point where all the other light can sort of come out. So let's add that in now. We're going to add a Shape 3D. Oh, sorry. Shape 3D. I've just triggered the wrong thing, so I'm just going to go back into the 5 view. If I can spell. Shape 3D. Let's hook this up to the root. Let's make this a material. Let's make it emissive as well. So we can just make this white. And then we can say, we don't want a sphere. We want to have let's go a rounded cylinder, something a little bit cleaner. Now, we gave originally a 0.4 radius for the subtraction, so we can say something like a 0.35 or a 0.35. A 0.35 is nice. And just make this taller. So now not only on the sides we have that lighting, which we can probably crank up a bit. Let's go 2 on the emission. We now have this glass in the middle that's starting to refract. All right, so now how we're talking about, we wanted to add some more detail to the front here. I'm using something called the slice deformer. Now, if you haven't used the deformers, there is a giant section of notch over here called deformers, and there's just plenty in there. It's really good for, as I would say, deforming mesh. Now, the cool thing with slice deformer is it will cut things into ribbons, like lines. So if we take our slice scale, crank it all the way up, like that, and we have the option of animating the pitch of it, or the rotation. So now we can get some more sort of angled looks. That roughness in the glass is diffusing it a bit much for me. So I can drop that, say, 0.01. So now if I zoom in here, we're starting to see what you would expect from the glass. Let's add some post effects to try and make it pop. So the first one that is going to come to mind straight away for me is glow. I use this on way too many things. So again, drag it in, Control R, we'll hook it up to the root node. Now this is going to be way too overblown to start with. Now I would always say, let's get our threshold and drag it in just so we start seeing some glow there. So it's about here. Also, we're refining 1,000 times here every time we stop. So let's add a refinement node. And let's just say set this to 5 for now. So it's only going to generate 5 refined passes just while we're working. It's just going to stop chewing up all of our resources. All right, now I've used glow. We can use glow 2. So glow 2 has been explained to me as more of a bloom than the previous one. And now what I like to do is crank it all the way up thresholds. So you're only really getting the tops, and then only subtly bring it in because it's just adding a nice sort of halo glow, kind of like the deep glow After Effects plugin would kind of do. So that's looking kind of cool as well. But we're really not getting a lot more of the reflections like the other scene would. And a lot of that comes from that external casing we have, that actual box. So back across here, we have a large geometry. Let's add a shape 3D. We want this to be a rounded box. And we want this rounded box to be 2 by 2 by 2. All right. It's going to block everything. It's not going to look really nice, but it's totally doing its job. So what we want to do here is add another glass material. This one can be separate to your first material. This one's going to handle the meshing. This one we need to make only viewable the back side of it. So hook in our glass. Immediately we can get some pretty cool effects, like this glass casing is starting to look really cool. But what we want it to do, instead of doing that, take off cast shadows and change it from double-sided to show back faces. So now, if I go to, let's just make a camera. So get a camera, drag it in, Control R, the 0 key, or up the top here to scene playing camera. Grab our camera and drag him backwards in Z space. And now we've got that camera sort of showing that border, that outside sort of shape there. Let's get our glass. Let's say we want to add a little bit of rim lighting just to sort of show that it's glass, a little subtle sort of look. So let's go 0.05. Because you're finding glass, like you want to sort of fake that reflection sort of look around everything else. So this is one way of doing it. Nope. So again, if we want to switch between cameras, 5, will take us to our orbit camera. We can position around, and 0 will put us back to where we've got our main camera. So I like this little bit of rim lighting here. Let's apply that to the main as well. So come across, enable rim lighting, 0.05. Maybe a little bit much, 0.025. Okay. All right, now let's take these materials we got here, which are 2. Let's make them 1 emissive, a little bit less bright. Oh, that's getting close. But now we'll say we want to make those orbit around the shape. So we go null, create a null object, hook that into your root. Now these 2 lights we want to orbit. Let's just control, shift, and click on their links, remove them, and add them to the new null we've created. We now want to come in and do a continuous modifier. Sorry, not condition, continuous. So if you're not familiar with modifiers, basically that's a lot of our logic and math systems. So things like your math will be your sine waves. Your continuous basically just keeps incrementing larger and larger and larger, which is really good for rotations. So let's say we here want to do a bank rotation like that. So let's just grab it in. Let's make this on our bank. And let's just say you are going to rotate around every 4 seconds, you go a full quarter. So we're getting pretty close. Now, what we might find is if we bring these in a bit closer, we're going to get it looking a little nicer. So let's just say 1.5 and minus 1.5. It's going to get close to what we're building. Let's maybe grab these and make them, Control Z. Grab these planes, Y, let's make them a lot larger. There we go. We want to come across to our glow and drop it down a fair bit more. Maybe even just put them out at 2. So 2 and minus 2. So now we're starting to get that look kind of like we had in the previous look. Maybe even make it a 25. Back out where we had them. All right. So that's our lighting sort of look coming in. Now we want to add all this across. Bring it out of the way. We've got to add our second lot of geometry to interact with it. So this is our first one. So imagine all of this lives inside our null. We can either just duplicate this and create another set of it. Come in, hook it up to the procedural mesh. And just for time, I'm going to use the same geometry as the previous one, just so we can get this through in the next 20 minutes. And remember to save. So what we're going to do after this is we're going to lift this null up. So it fills that gap. Roughly about there. And then we're also going to come into it. And before we've got our octagon, we're just going to flatten that down a little bit more, just to make these a bit thinner. So while it's pretty hard to see what's going on in this scene right now, and that's really one of the issues you'll run into a lot when you're running with glass, we can change the viewport shading to be normals. And now all of a sudden, it is much, much, much easier. We can even disable the ray tracing here. It is much, much easier to see how you're affecting your shapes. So about here, let's move it up a little bit more. And let's give it just a little bit more height so it can blend in properly. All right. So what we want to do here now, we've got this sort of look together. We want to say these nulls are now the top of the line that's interacting with each other. So this null only will interact with this null because they're on the same, they're both children of this procedural meshing. And they're the parent of everything below it. So we can come in here and say, let's go smooth union. And give it a second. And what we'll find is these shapes will start welding together. There you go. And this isn't going to be super obvious until we start modifying this. But if I start rotating this around, now you'll see as it starts to come in close to each other, especially along here, you're getting that nice sort of smooth interaction where those parts go again. So like we did with our rotating lights, we're going to come and do this with our continuous modifiers. We're going to put 1 on this null in the heading. And we're going to say we are going to go 22.5 in one way. And we're going to duplicate that across. And we're going to say minus 22.5. Hook that up into the second null. Cool. All right. Now we've got something that looks like it's moving around a bit more. Let's jump out of our viewport shading mode back into default. And we turned off ray tracing earlier. So let's turn it back on. And now we're starting to really see this look coming together. So if we want to, there's that rounded box. If we took that out, we're getting those 2 orbiting shapes. They're stepped around each other. They have the glass. If we wanted to render this out, I would suggest we do something like bumping up the quality, because at the moment we're on 256, 256. If this was just purely for rendering, this could hurt. I'm just going to go to 320 for everything now, just as a little bit of a jump up. So we have nice smoother edges. Under the Pathtracer, I'm going to say, let's go for maybe 3 reflection bounces, but 5 is good for refraction. Again, if we start looking at this like this, 1 pass of refraction isn't enough. 2 passes still leaves a lot of zones that are black. So we can keep just cranking that up until we get a zone that's nice and happy. So after 5, we start getting diminishing returns. So 5 is pretty good. Cool. All right. Let's go into our refinement. Let's change this to 50. I'm going to add full screen anti-aliasing. And just for the sake of getting a nice image out really quickly, I'm just going to add the AI denoiser. So now when I go into F9 full screen, I've got this procedural system. If I play it, it's orbiting around itself. It has the central lighting in the middle. The fake lights are orbiting around, changing the color up between them. And it is doing all the reflection and the refraction of the original scene. So all of this, we go F9, F9, F1, is come from using 2 different stacks of nulls. They're fusing together. And we have that glass RT material on. That glow is a little bit much still, so let's drop that down. Drop you down a bit as well. And maybe it's a touch more roughness. All right, so stepping in, we have turning these back on. We have the material that is emissive. We've got it set to unseen by camera. You can leave it visible, but again, you just want to have that lighting look. So we've gone over how to do fake area lights for reflections. We've shown how to bring in an environment here where it won't see certain things. If you really want to make this work nicer, you can come in and maybe say render layer. Just going to see if I can get this to work. If I make that its own render layer. And we also bring in that. No. Is it deferred? Deferred. Render buffer. No, disregard. I was trying to remember how I actually made the background in the original one. Yeah, so basically we have the border shape that is holding everything together. We have the area lights. We have the central glowing core. We have the glass that is set to refract and reflect. We're not using any of the lighting anymore. And we've got a post-process stack that will then tie that in. So first look done. Doesn't look exactly the same as the other one, but the other one was not built in 40 minutes. Okay, so again, we're just going to compare it back to the start tower here. So a lot more detail with the actual glows, some slightly different place lighting, and we had just a little bit more reflection bounce coming around inside it, because I think this was smoother. Sorry, rougher, the actual glass. Where are we? Yeah, F1. F2. Let's make him there. Sure, what would happen if we just bump our roughness up on our side walls. Oh, there you go. All right, so first project done. We stepped through, we took all the pieces out, we divided a bunch of geometry to make our shapes, rounded them off, added our glass, and now we've got a shape that we can endlessly change and morph around inside of Notch without any 3D modeling tools. So moral of the story for this is, for abstract things and any sort of like semi-complex geometry where you need to use booleans, you can probably get away with doing it inside of Notch instead of having to rely on an external 3D modeling tool. Okay, so while I've still got 3 minutes before the break, I am going to give a bit of a sneak peek at the next one. So this next section we're going to be doing is the bottles. So this scene here was actually quite a few render passes. But these bottles are built using the same basic bottle structure we had up the top here, but they just have a liquid inside of them. So this is going to animate up and down. We're going to have the light coming through, and we're going to get these really nice colors spilling into the ground. So if we show the final shot here, we're going to get these nice colors coming through. And that was the translucent shadows we were talking about earlier, set up to work here. So Yuki, have there been any questions come through?
I think it's okay so far. So you mean that it's the best time to take break?
Now is probably a good time.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a couple of minutes away from the break, but if no one has any questions right now, it's probably good to take the break now. We'll grab those 2 minutes and then tack them on to the end, because this next one might take just a little bit longer to put together.
Yeah, thank you so much. Or if you have if your audiences have any questions, please write on chat. And okay, take 10 minutes break, and the next time is the last part. So okay, see you 10 minutes later.